Tenapwe. Youth in crisis. Have you guys seen the stories in the news about our young people just not coming to school anymore? Yeah, I bet they're just sitting at home vaping, binging Netflix, gaming with their virtual friends, right? Why can't they just be productive members of society? Hopefully, what I'm about to share presents a slightly different take on it. Let's first start by understanding what I mean by youth. There's no standard definition, but generally they're understood as that bit between childhood and adulthood, that gap in the middle up to the ages of about 25, maybe a few more years for those of us needing a bit more extra time to mature. But from a neurological perspective, this is an acutely distinct moment in time. You see, brain development begins in the back of the brain, the limbic system, or the emotional centre. And it slowly makes its way to the front of the brain, where it eventually fully develops into the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is our rational centre, where all our reasonable and consequential thinking occurs. So what does this mean for our youth? Unfortunately, they're thinking and acting in their amygdala, their emotional brains. This is where all their impulsivities, those primitive desires, urges, aggressions, fears, and primitive desires are all located. In other words, they act before they think. They'll go way too fast in their first driving lesson, accuse you of literally being the worst parent, literally, in the whole world, refuse to wear the helmet, refuse to eat the veggies, refuse to slow down, refuse to hurry up. Just listen. Yep, I can see some of you nodding. Sounds familiar, right? But these aren't just symptoms of a half-baked adult brain. These are actually smart, evolutionary adaptations purposely designed in all social mammals to separate a young person's brain from the previous comforts and stabilities of their family lives and into one that's primed to explore new environments and seek outside relationships, which are all really important biological skills to help safeguard their survival in an incredibly complex world. But this decade of fragility, this grey space, this imbalanced moment between emotionality and cognitive reasoning, it's also a time that's highly influential and vulnerable. On the one hand, it's an age where they're most likely to be recruited as terrorists, but it's also an age primed for critical skill development and creativity. So pretty bleak, but also really optimistic. I'm sure you all remember around a decade or so ago when the Rena container ship spilled just off the coast here in Tauranga Moana, over 350 tonnes of oil into our pristine marine environment. Well, one weekend, as part of a group of volunteers, I was flown over to Motiti Island to do whatever we could do to help clean up the island over there. Now, while we were over there, this young local girl was given the task of being our team leader. Now, she knew the island inside out, and she had the physicality and the energy to take us to where we needed to go. She was your pretty typical young person as well, not interested in chit-chat. And you could just sense she was over being told what to do by those in charge. But when it was just us and her, she was amazing. She sprung into action. It was weird, like these two unique events had kind of collided. Over here, we had this really unexpected event which had created absolute chaos and devastation. And then over here, we had this young person who'd been given this unusually high level of trust and responsibility. Now, back on the mainland and over the coming weeks, I continued to observe this kind of unique collision of two worlds coming together. For example, one young girl had noticed that those cleaning up the beaches were putting in these long physical hours and probably needed a bit of kai. So over the course of a couple of days, thanks to her social networking skills, she had a house bursting at the seams with crock-pot deliveries and home baking, which eventuated into an organised food run. Some young guys were telling me how they'd been doing these epic kayaking missions through the night, rescuing oiled penguins from rocky outcrops and delivering them safely back to the rescue centres. But despite these examples and plenty more, most youth were just pissed off, told they needed to get off the beach, go home, they were told. But they didn't want to go home because they had ideas and thoughts. They felt that their voices weren't being heard. So they responded, but not with their voices, with their messages. And their messages gained international media attention in the process. But then eventually, as young people do, they just stopped listening. Why? Because they knew what needed to be done. It was obvious. So they just did it. Only army personnel allowed to clean up the beaches from now on, they were told. Whatever, thought one young guy who was cleaning the beach at that time. He ran home, threw on an old army dress-up uniform he had lying around, ran back to the beach and just continued carrying on, picking up the oil like before. An unusually high tide to hit our shores this afternoon, the newspapers said. Sweet as, thought one young guy, who texts their mates, who texts their mates, who texts more mates. Within 45 minutes, nearly 50 young people had arrived at Mount Maunganui Beach, shovels in hand, filling bags and bags full of oil and debris that was destined to be washed back to shore on the high tide. Examples like this got me thinking, what happens when you mix a crisis event with a young person? What if the very nature of the inner workings of a youthful brain could actually benefit society within the context of a crisis? Now, when I'm talking about crisis events, I'm talking specifically around environmental crises. So man-made ones like the Rena oil spill, for example, but also other environmental crises such as cyclones, flooding, earthquakes. Speaking of, you probably all remember the Student Volunteer Army, right? Who helped clean up after the Christchurch earthquakes. Well, there we saw a spontaneous, self-organised response. And, much like we learned with the inner workings of a young person's brain, there was definitely no patiently standing in line waiting for their high-vis uniforms to be issued. They definitely didn't diligently wait for the volunteer registration form to arrive in their inbox. They just got out there, hustled, networked, mobilised. Over the weeks, over 3,500 students cleaned over 60,000 tonnes of silt. They made a tangible difference to so many people's lives, and they did it quickly. And time matters in a crisis. But I know what you're thinking. These are just like one or two examples out of the box, right? Surely this isn't a thing. Well, the emergence of young people responding to crisis events is actually a significantly increasing phenomena throughout the world. And over the past decade or so, academic researchers like myself have really started to try and examine how young people view themselves in a community during these types of events and what it means to them to be a crisis volunteer. There's some pretty interesting insights. Firstly, young people don't necessarily see volunteering as something from the traditional sense of being community-minded and altruistic. Instead, many of them view it as something intrinsically linked to professional and personal development amidst uncertain employment futures. The short, episodic nature of a crisis event lends itself well to the structural changes that they've got going on in their life, like that transition from home to uni or home to the workplace or getting a job as a new grad. It signals to future employers that, hey, look, I've got skills and I applied them here. Of course, when they apply them in a crisis event, there's no ongoing commitment. It gives them a chance to participate in something new, exciting, adventurous, a little bit dangerous, something they say is so different to the risk-averse, bubble-wrapped, red-tape society they've been forced to endure their whole lives, they said. Those generational dynamics of a youthful brain, they really impact the way that they respond to a crisis. Take social media, for example. Yes, it allows them to mobilise and network, but it also gives that all-important platform for their voices to be heard, for them to vent their frustrations with authorities without fear of consequence and without being censored. It also provides that important desire they have for immediate gratification, posting images of before and after, the difference that they've made, receiving likes and comments. They like to organise themselves outside or separate to official responses. Why? Because by doing their own thing, they can bypass bureaucracy, overcome societal marginalisation, engage at their own discretion within their own timeframes, assert themselves as active agents in shaping their own future, and highlight their agency and resistance to power. Yeah, right, Sarah. You're just trying to pretend that they're some kind of romanticized young person. They're not lazy. They're actually undercover heroes about to solve all the world's crises, right? But what we've learned is that their response efforts actually work. They're highly networked, they're mobilised quickly, they're expedited on site incredibly quickly. Finally, crisis response practitioners throughout the world are beginning to take note. The National Preparedness Initiative developed by the University of Mississippi trains and recruits young people for emergency response and leadership skills. Here they offer young people a flexible, important, 5 to 10 week program, important. They give them the hands-on tools that they'll be using in a real emergency, which is pretty cool, important. It's so successful, it's now being rolled out in over 27 states throughout the US, scooping up national awards in the process. The Red Cross International Society now boasts a youth engagement strategy, and they recognise it's not enough to just involve youth in the response, but also that young people need to have a seat at the table for all management and governance decisions. Some universities throughout the world are now offering qualifications in disaster response, and some offering students who participate in actual crises throughout their university studies the opportunity to cross-credit some of those skills into unit standards towards their qualification. In 2021, when a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck the Caribbean coast of Haiti, killing over 200 people, it was the response from youth that hit the headlines. How they used technology combined with spontaneity and enthusiasm to hard-to-reach places. They were called by UNICEF in Haiti as a lever of change for our country, the future of Haiti. Just this past month, as Bangladesh saw some of the worst floods on record, which impacted over 5 million people, their youth mobilised. Using innovative technology like GPS mapping, drones and robots to target those minority populations that needed help. These examples and others like it illustrate the potential that young people can bring to crisis events. In Bangladesh alone, young people quantify over 25% of the population. Just imagine how that resource could be harnessed in the next crisis, because there's going to be lots more, eh? Climate change scientists estimate that 1 in 100-year weather events will now be occurring 17 times per decade. But it's not just enough to engage young people in the immediate aftermath of a crisis. To really understand and capitalise on the potential young people can bring to crisis response, practitioners really need to tap into the motivations that young people bring with them to these events, like seeking experiential opportunities for future employment. They really need to acknowledge how young people view themselves in society to better connect with this demographic. So, while I may not have completely changed your mind about the vape-smoking teen at home binging Netflix, hopefully I've been able to shift your perspective slightly around the neuroscience that's happening in their brain at this particular moment in time. And if we pick up that brain and put it within the context of a crisis event and accommodate for the potential they can offer during this time, then just imagine the potential they can bring as being active and contributing members to our societies in future crises. Because, after all, it's their future. So, crisis response heroes, tick. Unloading the dishwasher? Nah. Ngā mihi nui.